All right. Man, God damn it, the AI in Hearts of Iron 4 is just so bad sometimes. Wait, what? Okay, all right. Looks like we're having some reinforcements issues. Yeah, we're gonna attack Nanjing from multiple angles and hopefully take these guys out. Now, warfare in the early game in China is gonna be so ridiculously slow. Hopefully, it's going to not be that slow. All right. Hopefully it's not going to be that slow. Anyway, if we take Nanjing, we're going to take their capital, and we're also going to encircle some of their troops, and that would be quite nice. All right, so, yeah, warfare is super fucking slow because the armies over here are not real, like, professional militaries with, you know, fully modern equipment. They're just, like, a bunch of dudes with rifles. Definitely foreign trained and decently well organized, but the issue with the Chinese military around this time is that basically after the collapse of the Qing Empire in our lifetime, in our timeline, and I suppose after the collapse of... Well, the collapse of the Qing Empire also happens in the Kaiserreich lore. It's just that the Qing are restored after a while. So it doesn't really change anything. The new nationalist government / the new Qing government, new nationalist government in our timeline, and the new Qing government in the Kaiserreich timeline, are sort of unable to create a unified national military due to basically all of the provincial military governors not obeying the sort of orders of the state leaders anymore. This was because the state was falling apart, and a lot of times in Chinese history, when the state falls apart, what you have is warlordism. Basically, the military leaders of each individual region kind of take matters into their own hands and try to make something of themselves, basically as a form of social advancement / in some cases as a way of preserving sort of order in their local area. There is a... Oh, okay. So we have liberals in Sichuan. Shit, kind of cringe. Basically, as a way of... local elites have a way of sort of establishing their own sort of armed forces, traditionally, in times of crises in China. So that's that. All right. So encirclement complete. Let's actually destroy the pocket around Wuhu. And keep going. And then I suppose it would be nice to encircle these guys in the north. So let's see if we can. Shit. Never mind. Looks like they're gonna cover the retreat. Oh, well, there goes the League of Eight Provinces. They have been defeated. Very nice. So our intervention was definitely successful. Was definitely quite successful. Anyway, basically in times of crisis, in sort of ancient Chinese election results, victory, really. So results are in from the parts of China that are still stable enough to hold elections. Turnout was, as expected, quite low, but in cities like Beijing, we reached record numbers of votes from intellectuals, reformers, and others previously opposed to our rule. It appears the intervention, while robbing us of German support, has given us a large deal of political legitimacy and local support. In the aftermath of the victory, President Cao Kun has announced that he was stepping down to be replaced by Yan Huiqing. It is unclear how much of an influence Wu Peifu had on this decision, but it is clear that the Jade Marshal did not want any of Cao's drunken antics impacting the new government. So we have a new president, Yan Huiqing, and he will give us political power, and that is, of course, quite nice. Because lots of our... Ooh, yes, let's nationalize. Because lots of our... Oh, there goes the Anqing clique declaring war on the Shangqing Tianguo. Alright. Well, time to send in troops again. Wait. Wait, what? We still have volunteers? Yeah, all right. I guess our volunteers are still there. What? Oh, okay. I did not expect that. All right, but now we've got railroads. Look at how fast railroads are. Did you see that? The railroads are so fast. This is, I guess this really does, like, this no pause, this no pause format where most of the time I'm going at a lower speed really makes you appreciate just how, and you know, I can like micromanage more. Really makes you appreciate like how much, like how important these guys are. Sure, let's get some generals. Even though losing that political power is like kind of shitty just for some generals, but all right. Let us refugize the Sichuan clique generals. Anyway, basically, in this time period in Chinese history, as I already said, basically the central government fell apart after 1911, after the Wuchang Uprising and, you know, the Republican Revolution, which essentially destroyed the sort of millennia-long Chinese empire, right? And even when you had dynastic transition between one imperial dynasty and another, what you would have is that the state would fall apart, and, you know, in the chaos, a bunch of warlords would try to take control over the country or just their own individual areas, with, as I said, various like ideological positions. Some were just in it for themselves, some would be in it for some kind of ideological reformation or renewment, or maybe a preservation of the status quo and trying to sort of restore the empire as they saw it. So even with like periods of imperial transitions and even transitions between different Chinese dynasties, not even just foreign dynasties, because you do have like conquest dynasties, so basically foreigners coming in and taking over the Chinese empire. Even in these periods, in the feudal period, you could have basically mini or gigantic warlord eras, right? So when the millennia-long Chinese empire falls apart and is replaced by a initially very unstable republic due to a billion reasons, what you have is that you have this warlordism rising again. Now, the Chinese Republic, the way it was born in and of itself was in part a sort of popular uprising, and in part a sort of the army of Imperial China kind of switching sides and joining the revolutionaries. So this sort of ensured that the military would have a massive sort of impact in the early years of the Republic, and that is, as I said, in the 1910s, you know. And the first president of the Republic was pretty famously, a pretty famous guy called Yuan Shikai, and he basically was the protege of a former military leader who was a warlord in his own right in a previous collapse of the Chinese Empire, that being the Taiping Rebellion. And so basically he was Yuan Shikai, the guy who took over in 1911, was a warlord who was sort of politically educated by another warlord, although definitely Yuan Shikai was a lot more coarse of a warlord, a lot less, you know, sort of, I guess, institutionally aware and institutionally, like, morally upright than his mentor. So yeah, Yuan Shikai was kind of a, you know, kind of a bad apple among bad apples, but he also sort of rose to power in a position where he could sort of create his own dictatorship, right? Because he basically switches sides from the Qing government, the Qing imperial government, to the revolutionaries led by the KMT, you know, Sun Yat-sen, the political ancestors of these guys down here, and so the Chinese nationalists. And at that time, the Chinese nationalists didn't really have their own army. They kind of just had, you know, militia uprisings / army units that would defect to them. So it was kind of a revolution by conspiracy. So when the Imperial Army switches sides, or at least the most important commander in the Imperial Army switches sides, you know, that is obviously a pretty big boon But, you know, because they accepted the defection, they also basically had to accept that Yuan Shikai would be the first president of China. And then, of course, he tried to restore the empire with himself as the emperor. You know, he created his own, instead of a like democratic Chinese republic, he created his own military dictatorship. And so the sort of political institutions of the Chinese Republic were shaped in its basically first 3 decades by this sort of original sin of instability and, you know, military control. Now, this results in basically the collapse of the Chinese Republic after Yuan Shikai died. So Yuan Shikai dies in 1916, and what you have is that all of the military leaders that Yuan Shikai had sort of appointed under him to be his cronies are now in control of the armies around the country that are basically the only, that Yuan Shikai himself ensured would be the only source of political authority, right? So what you have is that you have a recipe for basically state collapse, right? And also, pretty important is the fact that Yuan, in the final years of his rule, had to endure another popular uprising known as the Second Revolution that was coming from the south and was trying to sort of sweep the country. This is called the Constitutional Protection Army. And the Constitutional Protection Army was, again, those remnants of the nationalist sort of nationalist revolutionaries, right? And so you have at this point that the nationalists are defeated by the by all the warlord armies that are loyal only to their, you know, to their commanders, that are increasingly sort of starting to become independent little cliques of their own and forming their own like independent principalities in each province, right? And so basically the state is collapsing, the central authorities are collapsing, and at that time the Chinese army, which is where we started this whole like, this whole charade, charade? No, that's not a word. That's where we started this whole commentary, is the sort of state of the Chinese army in the early 30s. Basically, the Chinese state in the late years of the Qing was investing heavily in a modernization program for the Imperial Army and was trying to create sort of modernized units that would be trained and equipped along with Western you know, alongside Western standards. Now, China at that time was an immensely poor country, but it was an immensely poor country per capita. So with some sacrifices, because the country was massive, it could equip a small amount of forces, equip and train small amounts of forces in sort of Western, like, state-of-the-art fashion, right? So what you have is that you have a tiny portion of the army that is pretty modern, you know. It's got modern guns, it's got modern... yeah, there goes Zhang Tianran, the cult leader over here. We have exterminated him, very good. Alright, now we're gonna turn to the south and start to fight the guerrillas. I'm really not looking forward to this, but alright, let's get down here. Let's go down and fight the guerrillas. So basically, do we have artillery actually? We have 146 artillery guns. Now you guys are what kind of unit? Oh no, Zhili Infantry Division. Oh wait, I can't switch you out. Oh, but you guys are National Infantry Divisions. Okay, so let's actually copy the National Infantry Division, duplicate, and get some artillery. I want to copy. Let's rename it to Big Pow. Let's see if we can switch you guys over to artillery units. Yeah, just enough. 144 artillery guns. let's get those artillery guns working on the rebels. So basically, what you have is that this armed force that was the focus of the Qing so-called self-strengthening movement. Self-strengthening being basically just trying to make China more powerful. The issue is they have fickle commanders, and they have all this modern... They have all this modern equipment, right? They have all this modern equipment, they have all this training, and so they're basically, compared to the other facets of the Chinese state, they're like leagues ahead, right? So initially, what they can do is they can just walk all over everyone else, because the civilian side of government wasn't nearly as advanced as the troops. But very, very quickly, once the army is in charge of the whole country, and then it starts to splinter into a ton of rival factions, so the warlord cliques, once it starts to splinter into a ton of rival factions, obviously the issue starts to become, oh shit, you know, these guys are starting to fight each other with all their modern guns, right? And they're hundreds of, you know, potentially hundreds of thousands of troops. Even though Imperial China wasn't a very militarized state, it was a very populous state. So if the army is small, but small by Chinese standards, it's still massive. It's still hundreds of thousands of troops, you know. So you have hundreds of thousands of troops fighting each other with modern rifles in the 1910s, right? What happens in 1918? Well, World War I is over, right? And so what happens when World War I is over? Well, all of these warlord cliques that are, you know, the mortal enemies of each other and are just like fighting each other all the time for influence and power. And, you know, they're making alliances and betraying each other all the time. We're going to get further into warlord politics when we talk about the political angle of things. What you have is that these warlord cliques that, you know, rule over a poor country, but a poor country that still has potentially tons of resources, because it is, as I said, it's still China. So even though per capita there's not a lot to go around, there is a lot in total. There are a lot of resources in total. What these warlord cliques start doing is they start taxing the hell out of their citizens, and they start to plunder the countryside with their troops and stuff. And they start to buy a bunch of World War I surplus weapons and sort of military advisors from a bunch of Western countries. So what you now have is that you have a bunch of countries who have a ridiculous amount of guns that they don't need anymore, and warlord states in China that need the guns. That is a lake, okay. That need the guns and have hundreds of thousands of, potentially hundreds of thousands of soldiers that can use them. So this leads to two things, basically. You have the degradation of the state into basically just, you know, a machine to perpetuate this sort of warlord protection racket kind of deal, where each single warlord is kind of only focused on militarizing his own province. And you have the fact that this sort of degrades the ability of the state in general to sort of continue the programs of modernization that were ongoing, right? But they can still buy the guns, you know? So they cannot modernize, but they've got modern guns, and they've got, you know, big artillery and tons of people with guns, you know, running around. So this is obviously kind of an issue, you know? This is obviously kind of an issue, and it leads to sort of the country being itself kind of plundered, you know? it leads to kind of the country falling apart. And discipline among these warlord armies becomes very, very shit. So in terms of armaments, going into the late 20s and the early 30s, you know, the Chinese armies were only really like a couple, like 5 or so years behind, because what they were buying is essentially 1920s, 1920s and 1910 weapons that the other great powers did not have a need for anymore because they were demilitarizing. But a lot of the sort of modernization efforts in other areas, such as, you know, officer academies and the likes, you know, the sort of soft... Wait, what? Why is there no supply connection to the capital? Ah, right. So apparently we need to convert these railways? This is ridiculous. What the fuck are you talking about, dude? How the fuck do we have no supplies? I would certainly love to have some supplies. But I guess if we take this tile in Yuzhang, then we're gonna have a connection to Anqing. Yeah, because currently supplies are coming down to the railway, right? But railway connection to Hangzhou, I kind of wish this... I kind of wish I could see, like, how long it's gonna take to convert this fucking railroad. Anyway, let's actually get some fucking Chinese music ongoing. There we go. So, you know, that was very, very basically the situation of Chinese armies, you know? And this is why it's just so difficult to fight around here, because we're basically just fighting World War I over and over, but with even less organized troops and basically no air forces. Well, yeah, right, air forces. Send volunteers, send air volunteers. I wonder how many we can send. I'm sure it would be helpful. 16. Oh god, we can send 16 planes over. No! Let's send 10 bombers and fight 5 fighters. You know. Alright, let's create those air wings and send them down. 16 aircraft to the rescue. We're gonna bomb the hell out of these insurgents with 10 aircraft. Anyway, this creates an environment, basically, where insurgencies and banditry can sort of fry, right? And here is, I guess, where we go to... where we go one, we go all. No, sorry, that's kind of cringe. That just kind of sounded like it in my head. Where we can talk about the insurgents that we are currently fighting, the left Guomindang. Now, in the Kaiserreich timeline, we are currently the Qing government fighting the left KMT in sort of southern Hunan and northern Fujian. Now, Hunan is this province, and Fujian is this province. Both pretty southern, actually extremely southern, extremely Hunan, an extremely kind of rural place. Very important are the rivers that intersect through it. Very important is the rice agriculture. Very important are some of the cottage industries. Fiercely independent kind of culture around here. It's kind of one of China's many Scotlands, I would suppose. Not as much as some of the southwestern provinces, but definitely a kind of like peasant rebel, like a tradition. Like it's a province that has a long tradition of peasant rebellions and stuff. Fujian less so, but Fujian has a bunch of mountains. Fujian is basically divided in two. It's got port cities and mountains. And in the mountains is people that want to kill each other all the time, or rather that are good at killing each other all the time. Fujian is basic, and in the ports you have basically piracy, like a history of piracy and mercantilism. So these are provinces that are sort of right when the state falls, you know, you can expect funny shit to happen over here. And what you have in the late 20s is that we're going to get to the Chinese sort of labor leftist movements somewhat soon. I suppose when we're going to talk about Nasera, when we have enough time to talk about the Chinese left. We're going to talk about the origins of the Chinese left and, you know, what they were doing. Because this No Pause, in case you haven't, like, watched or listened to my Victoria 2 No Pause, I try to focus very heavily on sort of history commentary. And you know, having the sort of Hearts of Iron gameplay being in the background and trying to explain as much history as possible behind what is going on the screen. Because, you know, nobody, well, not nobody else does it, but it's, you know, it's a way to differentiate myself, and it's definitely what is most interesting about my content. Are these guys fucking Bharatiya Commune? Yeah, these guys are Indians. All right. So we're going to kill the Indians in the mountains of fucking western Jiangxi, really, but yeah. So basically, you have that the central government is falling apart, and even local, like, warlord cliques and governments are unable to keep control over their territories. And you have these provinces in the south of China that are sort of prime for rebellion, and they love fucking rebelling every single fucking time in history, right? What you have is that the Chinese Communist movement is evicted from the cities in 1927, when Chiang Kai-shek sort of takes over the KMT in 1926. He evicts them from Canton, Guangzhou. But the communists are still very, very strong in Shanghai and in sort of the cities along the Yangtze River, and then, you know, the industrial cities around here. And they, at the time, were under the control of the Northern Warlords, the Northern Republican Warlords this time, not monarchists, because this is our timeline I'm talking about. But Chiang Kai-shek comes north of the Northern Expedition, you know, sort of plows through the Northern Warlords, reaches Nanjing and Shanghai, and in accordance with the Shanghai industrialists, with the Japanese, and with the Shanghai mafia, the sort of triads. This also happens in other cities such as Ningbo, Nanjing, and such, you know, along the path where the southern troops are marching. Former German factories reopen, support supplies or civilian goods. I need army experience.